Hello, everyone. Oh, great. It's a pleasure to be here. I actually started my career in Oak Park, interestingly enough, for a client that was in Milwaukee. And I might be dating myself a little bit, but we were actually building middleware in a health insurance company. So it's a pleasure to be back here. But what I'm going to talk about is very different from that experience. But I'll tell you a little bit more about myself. I run a company that's based in Ghana, in West Africa. We have anywhere from 15 to 30 people, depending on the projects we have and the size of them. It is primarily a software development company, but we do consider ourselves an advisory firm, primarily because we found that building software has a lot less to do, at least in our environment, has a lot less to do with the actual technology than it has to do with the problem that we're trying to solve. So let me just tell you a little bit more about the environment. I moved back to Ghana in 2009. I missed home. That was pretty much the long and short of it. And by that time, I had a role in a global product manager, project manager, design role for an accounting firm, and had been spending the last sort of 7, 8 years before I left building technology that was used in 160 countries around the world. And so I was used to enterprise software development. We would build custom from scratch. And I thought, at the top left here, that that would be a similar environment to what I experienced here in the States and in London. It wasn't at all like that. The private sector in Ghana is a lot smaller. They use a lot of COTS packages, which don't really fit the environment. And so I found that instead of doing software development, people were doing software implementation, and it just wasn't a great fit for where I wanted to go and what I wanted to do. At the same time, I started looking up statistics because I could see that the number of users we had were 1,000, 2,000, and 1,000, 2,000, and that's not really kind of what I was interested in, because I realized that 70% of our population lives in the rural areas. And that rural areas, like the one on the bottom right, and sometimes in sort of crowded areas in the city, where most of the people in the city live, like the bottom left. And then I just put a picture on the top right so you could see how gorgeous it is. So I realized that I really wanted to be solving the problems that are experienced by the majority of not just Ghanaians, but Africans. And that really caused a change in my career. So I left the Big Four and went ahead and joined a company that was just starting out. I'm not sure that this is showing well. And so what I do today, most people often consider as frugal innovation. I tend to speak on this topic a fair bit. And we've realized that frugal innovation is essentially building software cheaply, but ending up with a product that is also relatively less expensive, right? So it's those two things. It's the process by which we do it actually doesn't cost as much, and the product that you end up with doesn't cost as much. And the reason is that the end users can't really afford expensive things. And what we've found about frugal innovation is that the definition is really sort of understanding the domain, understanding the context in which the software is going to be used, but also making sure that you account for all the constraints. And so I'm going to delve into that a little bit more. So I tend to think of frugal innovation as constraint-driven development. And the thing about constraints is that we have a ton of them on the continent. And this is just a few. So you've probably heard of some of these things, like power and electricity is one. So in some places, you're not really even getting electricity. The lights will go off. For example, in Accra, the city in which I live, most people who can afford an apartment or a house have some kind of generator. If you can't afford a generator, you probably have an inverter. And power is intermittent. And I'll show you some examples of how we've actually worked around that. Connectivity is a huge challenge as well. And I mean, the reality is that we didn't really have many copper wires, we didn't have many landlines. And so when mobile came, something like 99.98% of the continent had no connectivity until we had mobile. And so that's a huge consideration as well. Even today, even though we've got a lot of people who actually have mobile phones, it's still something that we have to think about. Literacy is also a consideration. So for example, in Ghana, literacy is relatively high at about 70-something%. But even if that's the case, it doesn't necessarily mean that when they see instructions on a screen that they will understand everything that you're writing. And so we have to think about ways to actually communicate with our users that doesn't necessarily involve a lot of text. It could be more image, picture-based. It could actually be voice-based. And so those are all considerations that we have to put in. The address system. I always say that when you're giving addresses in our part of the world, it's always like, okay, you go right. When you see the woman selling mangoes, don't take that left. Take the next left. And when you see the tree, ask there for the place. It's like, how does that work? If you're trying to deliver, I mean, Amazon, how's that going to work? So a lot of plots have numbers. So they don't have house numbers, not necessarily street numbers. And that could change in 5 years when the area does get developed. So building for that is interesting as well. Peripheral devices is another big consideration. Even though there's more and more smartphones on the market, we still have a large segment of the population who can't really afford anything more than a feature phone. So that's basically numbers, no WhatsApp, no smart screen, any of that. So we still have to build for that. So SMS, USSD, still big in our part of the world. Cash is another big consideration. We've been trying to push mobile payments for a while, we're still not getting there. I think everyone here has probably heard of M-Pesa, right? M-Pesa comes out of Kenya. M-Pesa was owned by Safaricom, which is the large telecom in Kenya. And I don't know the current statistic, but certainly a few years ago, something like 20% of the GDP at least was going through this mobile payments platform. And it's been around for a while, at least 10, 11 years, something like that. And the reality is that we have 53 to 64 countries on the continent, depending on who's counting. But all of those countries have tried to replicate what M-Pesa did, and no one has really gotten there. And so we're still trying to figure out how to do mobile payments, because cash is just difficult to handle, particularly when you're trying to do technology systems. So we need to get something that's electronic. And so those are a lot of the constraints of just the environment that we end up having to build for, almost regardless of what solution, what industry you're building for. And another consideration, I get this question when I'm talking about frugal innovation, which is, well, is the tech you build really any different? And the tech that we build tends to be influenced by the constraints that are up on the screen, right? Which are skills availability, availability of finding the engineers, and basically the whole team. It's still quite a challenge. We definitely have had some players over the last, I'd say 5 to 8 years that are changing that, but that takes time, and it takes a while. And we're also faced with the fact that for a number of people, it makes more sense to leave the continent and continue their careers elsewhere. So skills availability is high, is low, and then you also find that the tech stack that people are familiar with is older, right? So we're still on PHP for a lot of the applications around PHP version 5, maybe, right? So we're not using some of the newer technologies for everything. And being able to get the resources to understand new technologies is a challenge. And so it takes a while, actually, to bring the software up to where it might actually work in other parts of the world. Our life cycle is pretty much the same, except you'll find that most people don't do things like pair programming. Again, that's sort of related to skills availability. So you'll find a lot of people sort of coding by themselves. Testing, for instance, we don't do a lot of TDD necessarily. We still have a lot of manual testing. And it makes sense if you think about we're still a highly labor-intensive economy. So a lot of times, rather than find somebody who understands how to sort of test software electronically, it's easier to hire someone and have them test manually. So I think we tend to describe our software industry as sort of being behind the various continents, so being behind the Americas, maybe 5 years, being behind Europe, maybe 4 years, things like that. And so that just gives you some idea of the context in which we're in. So that's constraints. And the next thing I wanted to talk about was the context, the domain. And I'll do that by telling you a story. So I have an uncle who left Ghana when he was a teenager, came to the US, New York, and studied, ended up going to, I think it was NYU, became a doctor, a medical doctor, and decided after his first few years of residency that he wanted to go back and give back to his home. And quite a number of people got excited. He actually got a number of other doctors and nurses who all wanted to go along. And the interest really caught on to the point where they actually got funding to be able to take everybody. And so instead of him just thinking about doing something in his village, he decided to do a bunch of villages all around where he grew up, which is fantastic. They ended up settling on doing something around family planning, teaching women how to take the pill, because in Africa we still have the situation where you might have families that are too large to feed, to clothe, to send to school. And so if you can get in early enough so that people don't have such large families, then you can actually have people who are well-educated, well-fed, and brought up, and become very productive members of society. So they thought this was a great thing. They learned all about monitoring and evaluation. We're going to go measure this. We're on point, right? So they go, and they actually have figured out that they're going to take the women out for a 2-day workshop, and they've asked permission from their husbands, and they're going to run them through everything that they need with practical exercises. Everything was just perfect. And then they leave and come back a year later. What should happen, right? Then the incidence of pregnancy should go down. Incidence of childbirth should go down. That's not what happened. It didn't stay the same. It went up in both cases. And so now they have to start figuring out what the heck happened. So they start going around and asking everybody, like, so women, did you come to the workshop the full 2 days? Yes. Did you understand everything we said? Yes. Were your husbands mad at you? And so they didn't support you when you got home? No. Everything was good. So what happened when you went home? And so when they started asking that, they would say that their husbands told them to sit down and tell them everything that happened, which they did. And they said, okay, so how was your husband? Oh, he was fine. Everything was good. He understood. He liked it. But, like, what's the but? He said, I am the man of this house. If anybody shall take the pill, it shall be me. Context. Context. And so the thing that you realize is that even though my uncle was from this region, spoke the local language, he missed that one little thing. Like, how are you going to actually figure out that one little thing until you're actually out there trying out the solution and seeing what the results are? And we find that that's very much the same thing when we're building software. If you miss one little thing, the whole thing goes kaput, because it's really more about the context than it is about the technology, we found. So the domain in which you're working in absolutely makes all the difference. Right? I'll mention one other thing about coding, and I guess this is both a constraint and a domain thing. On the screen, on the left-hand side, you'll see the picture of Africa with just one single line around. That was a SAT-3 cable. So this is circa 2004, I think up to 2008. We basically had one submarine cable that serviced the entire continent. You can imagine, that's not getting anywhere. And you see the landing points? There's only a few countries that it even lands on. Now fast forward to 2014, which is on the right-hand side. The submarine cables around the continent increased by over 1,000%. Right? There was a lot of funding that sort of came in from the World Bank and other entities that really had people pumping a lot of submarine cables into our seabeds, with more connection points and some that were actually connecting the interlocking countries as well. Now, this of course changes things, because even with the SAT-3 cable, the SAT-3 cable had more connectivity than the copper that was in the ground. So you can imagine what that has done in terms of connectivity on the continent, and specifically in terms of mobile. So we had nothing, sort of 2000, and look at that. By 2016, we're already at 80% mobile penetration throughout the continent. And the interesting thing is that most people have more than one SIM card. Right? So I have one for every network in my country, because, I don't know, maybe my aunt is on MTN, so if I call her there, it's cheaper. My dad is on Vodafone, so if I call him there, it's cheaper. So there is a little bit of inflation in those numbers, but the reality is that there is, when I go to the village, the only thing anybody ever wants from me is a phone and SIM card. That's how much it is valued. So this has really changed the way that we build technology, because it's not really, people say we're a mobile-first continent. We're not mobile-first. We're really mobile-only. So even when we're building websites, we have to make them mobile responsive, because that's how majority of people are actually going to access it. Yeah. So let me run you through a few stories, just to kind of demonstrate what I mean by domain and context and all of that stuff, and constraints. So the gentleman there is called Herman Chinrihesi. If you've never heard of him, he's kind of considered the father of software development on the continent. Herman kind of developed this software. He has a bunch of products, and I'll show you another thing that he developed as well. And Hey Julo is a word in Ghana. I don't know what language, actually. We have 75 languages in Ghana, but 5 semi-national languages. But Julo is used by everybody. And what happens is, if I go to the market and I say, if somebody stole something from me, and I say, Julo, 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 that person stole something from me, let me tell you what will happen. Everybody around me will drop their stuff, pick up their trousers or their skirts, chase that person, pull him down, and beat him up. Totally. This is like, there's no police here, and the police will come and join sometimes. They don't ask any questions. Just beat you up. It's actually not good. We actually need to change it, because it can become very aggressive. They can actually put a tire and light it up, and it can get too aggressive, and people get really hurt, and some people have passed from it, but we do need a justice system. But Herman was thinking about, well, why can't we implement technology in a security system? And rather than importing something from the West, why can't we use some of this social phenomenon that happens? And so what he did was, he basically recreated that. And you can use a simple feature phone, press 1, basically speed dial, or however you do your hotkey, to call the Hey Julo number. You would have signed up for the service, and when you signed up, you would put up to 5 people in your home in it, up to 5 of your neighbors in the phone. And when you press that number, it basically will call all those people, and it would call the radio stations, and it would call the police. And what would happen is the radio station would start saying, house number 7255. Yes, the one by the mango tree. They are being robbed. Go, 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 go. And people would show up. And it's very simple application. It was a .NET application, but just by using SMS, you could activate that. And what they found was, they actually created stickers out of that thing on the right-hand side. What they found was, just by putting the sticker up with Hey Julo, and people knowing what it does, crime went down. So they didn't even get too many calls. I think the first one was a guy who was being beaten up by his wife. Who knows what he did? And the other one was actually an emergency call. Somebody was actually having a stroke. And so that was actually helpful to get some help there. So that's one example, that domain and using the social phenomenon makes all the difference. This one is a story about constraints. So the gentleman there is Randolph. Randolph, very smart young lad. At the age of 14, he was already starting university classes, so he started early, very bright. And he was just ready to absorb and learn as much as he possibly could. One of the things that he found was that everything was available online. Also a software engineer, actually worked for me at ThoughtWorks. And he was ready to absorb all the information, but it was too costly to buy data to get all the information. So what he ended up doing was he built a browser called Ananse on GitHub, if you want to look at it. And it doesn't have a whole lot of features, but the important thing it has is that you can actually store your favorite sites. And when the data cost is low, which was typically between 12 p.m. and 5 a.m., it would actually go out to those sites and download the latest copies. So you don't have to disturb your sleep to get all the latest information. So when you get up at 5 or 6, your news is there, all the latest lessons in class are there. And so that's an interesting solution to solving a constraint. And I think that's one of the things we found is that constraints, if you don't have the constraints, you just don't come up with these ideas. There's something about living in the space where the constraint happens that makes these solutions happen. I had a staff person who had, before she joined us, had joined one of those competitions, hackathons, with a team. And they had actually won. And their prize was to get a space in a hub for a year where they could actually have people who would help them kind of evolve the idea and their solution. And it was interesting because she said when she got there, because it was a nice space, air-conditioned, all that, she said with all the air conditioning blowing in her face, she forgot the problem she was trying to solve. So a year passes and they haven't evolved much. So one of the things that we think about when we're actually building the software is we introduce the constraints. We can't sit in the city and think we're going to build something for the village. It doesn't work. You have to go to the village and experience it and figure out that men are not going to take the pill. So this is another interesting one. So this is also by Herman's company. And this has even sort of evolved because now we have a lot more mobile payments. But this is circa 5 years ago. And the challenge was, how do we get people to how do we get past the cash challenge? And so what they did was, you know, like phones, we have a lot of prepaid cards. And so he said, well, let's just get prepaid cards of like 10 CDs. Our currency is called CDs. And so they would sell, say, 10 CDs on a card. So you go to the vendor, you give the vendor cash, you get your 10 CD card, which has your code on it. You would actually then scratch the card when you're ready to use it, put in the number, but I don't know if you've used that card before, or I need to find out exactly what the value is. And so I would actually send an SMS, so the user would actually type in the number. It goes by SMS to a processing server. I'll explain the server in a second. It goes to a processing server where you can actually get information. So it goes to a processing server, right? From the processing server, I need to validate that against the entire list of numbers that I've issued. So it goes to that validation server. And then from the validation server, it tells me, yep, you still have 10 Ghana cedis left. You can credit whatever the product you're trying to buy is. Now, coming from the West, we probably would think about literal servers or server space, at least, some kind of security, SSL, authentication, middleware, something. Not in our part of the world. The servers became laptops. The laptops had SIM cards. So basically, the first processing laptop was calling the validation laptop, right? So basically sending an SMS, rather, to get that validation back. And all they did for security was they would put the laptops in different locations. Under your auntie's bed, in a drawer somewhere. case of P. So very simple and frugal. This is an interesting story out of Nairobi, where Nairobi has the 4th worst traffic in the entire world. Lagos has the 2nd. And in Lagos, there actually have been instances where the traffic was so bad, people left their cars and took motorbikes home and came back the next day to pick up their cars. That's how bad traffic gets. And so this that came out of the IBM research lab in Nairobi, they decided to get cameras, to put cameras around to actually be able to calculate and see the rates of traffic and where the traffic was really expensive. So they took low fidelity cameras that, as you can see on the bottom left, could at least see the dark spaces where the roads were. And so using that, the black and white images of how dark the spaces were, they would sort of see how much was being covered and uncovered and at what rate. And they used that as an approximation of traffic flow. And then just by sending an SMS to say, I'm going from point A to point B, it would tell you what is the most effective way to go. And so by using that, they were actually able to redirect traffic more efficiently. This is an interesting project that we did starting about 3 years ago. Ghana has the largest e-waste dump in West Africa, which is significant because it has been a dumping ground for a lot of industrial companies and countries. And it's this huge expanse of a space. When we first started and we registered the users who were there, registered the people who were there, because there's a lot of people, some of them even barefoot, who are trying to make a living from the dump by finding old mobile phones that they can fix up and things like that. Within, I think it was 48 or 72 hours, we registered 600 people who made a living in this e-waste dump. And so what we decided is we partnered with an architecture firm. They built a building. They also were the ones who designed that structure that you see there, which is a makerspace, EcoCraft, which you can actually take down and move. And the idea was to make sure that the people who were working in the e-waste dump could safely find and take apart basically the products that they were trying to use to create new products, that they could get designs basically for the products that they wanted to create, and that they could trade with one another. And so that application was really more about using pictures, so it had to be a smartphone, first of all, using pictures and using voice. You could call another person, say, I'm looking for this part, look at the picture, do you have it, let's trade. So that was a very interesting use as well. And I'll tell you one more, because to me this is an example of, it takes more than one innovation to kind of put some of these solutions together. Because a lot of times the entire process that you're trying to enable or the chain that you're using, you don't have all the things set. Like electricity is not necessarily there, I need to find a solution for that. Right? Connectivity is not necessarily there, I need to find a solution for that. So this was a perfect example. And for this one, what we really wanted to do was we wanted to organize the paper in hospitals and clinics, the medical records. I'm actually a trained medical informatician, so is the person I worked with on this. And he will tell you that, you know what, we talk about connectivity and big EMRs and all that, but paper cannot go through wire. So we have to find another way to organize the paper and then a way to transcribe what is on the paper into an electronic form. So the first thing we needed to solve was how to organize paper. And as you can see, it's highly disorganized. On the right-hand side, you'll see sometimes it spills out of the records room. It's sort of all over the place, and people can't find your records. We found that the average wait time in OPDs was literally 3 hours, right? Which is way too long to actually see a doctor. A lot of people would just leave. And so what we ended up doing was first we cleaned up all the records. In some cases, we actually found that people would have 14 folders. That's because every time they would go to the hospital, they can't find the old record, so they would just buy a new folder and start up a new record. And records anyway were destroyed in 7 years. So your medical history doesn't really exist unless you take care of your folders. And so that's what we found. People would take their folders home to make sure that they had their medical history whenever they needed to go back in. So the first thing to do was to organize the files and deduplicate. And you can see on the bottom left what that started to look like. So you can easily find where you're going to find that record. And then on the right-hand side, we barcoded everyone. And we only captured 8 pieces of information. Your first name, your last name, your first mobile phone number, your second mobile phone number, your national health insurance ID, your next of kin, their number, and I've forgotten what the 8th piece was. But that was all the information that we collected and we put into a system. So when you come in, which you can just search by your name, most of the time it was actually your phone number, and we would find your record, swipe it, and you're good to go. So remember that 3 hours wait time that I mentioned? Guess what it became? 10 minutes. Just by doing that. And now we can build an EMR on top of that, which the government is actually doing now. One of the interesting things we found is that the mobile phone number was really interesting because my name, I have 5 names. Betty, Rachel, Enyonam Kumahor. But I have only one last name. But I can go anywhere as Betty Kumahor, Enyo Kumahor, it's completely legal. There are some tribes, even within my country, where your last name is not even static. So I can show up one day as Kweku Mensah, and the next day I can be Nana Akufo. It's perfectly fine. And so the name, we can't trust that the name is actually going to allow us to uniquely identify you. But people don't mess with their phone numbers. So we literally found like one guy who had been sending, and we only found him because of the phone number that was tied to the record. He was using his national health insurance for 8 people. And so we actually were able to use that to uncover some fraud within the system as well. So I'll tell you one more story. Because it's interesting when I give this talk, because a lot of times it's a very different environment from Chicago, right? And so people are like, how does this apply to what we're doing? And I don't know the answer to that question yet. I think it'll be interesting to start working a bit more together and figuring out what can port and what can be learned. I'm certainly doing more thinking and thought around what makes frugal innovation work and how do you introduce innovation into more mature environments and companies. And there's definitely some lessons learned around that. And some of that we've already seen, right? It's fail fast, keep evolving the model. It's introduce constraints, that's a big one. If you want something that's cheaper, make sure that the budget goes down, all of those things. But this was an interesting one because this is a project that we contributed to from Uganda when I was working in the company there. And it is actually sponsored by the UN. Rapid FTR stands for Rapid Find, Trace, and Family Trace and Reunification. So in areas of natural disaster or conflict, children get separated from their families. And so what Rapid FTR does is, with a trained professional, you can come in and take information about the child and use that to actually find their families. Right? And this was interesting because we had actually first implemented it in the Congo when there was a conflict there. And what we found was that the paper format, the carbon sort of paper format that they had used before, would have taken 11 months to register, I think it was about 10,000 children. And this system, it took 3 weeks to actually do that. So you're reuniting children with their families a lot quicker. And when we found out about the Philippines typhoon, I think this was probably 5 years ago or so, we were readily placed to help with that. So what we ended up doing was we literally just went out into the store, bought some Android phones, contacted the people we had worked with at UNHCR, and within a few days, They landed in the Philippines, and with rapid FTR, actually had about 600,000 children identified within the system, and mapping them with your children. So for me, this was really one of the examples where we've actually been able to build something on the continent that is exportable, that we've been used in other environments. And so I would like to see more of that, and I'm looking forward to that. So, and that is it for my talk.